Hello, dear friends, I'm Vitalii Portnikov. So-called heads of so-called People Republics, Pushilin and Pasechnik, declared about evacuation of population due to threat of Ukrainian attack. These statements of so-called heads of so-called People Republics are not, of course, their initiative. We understand very well that there are no states on the occupied by Russian Federation territories of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts do not exist, and that so-called People Republics is a screen for Russian curators, mercenaries, and the Kremlin that executes a real management of the occupied territory, and that the statements about the evacuation of the population under the Russian occupation would not have been made unless they had received the orders from Russian capital. And now it's important to understand why those statements were made. After all, we understand very well that Ukrainian armed forces are not going to attack the occupied by Russia territory of Donbass. Moreover, Ukrainian President Zelensky and other leadership of Ukraine keep repeating that they want to resolve the question of restoration of Ukrainian integrity exclusively through peaceful means, by diplomatic means of negotiations, and not by military means. And in this not desire to resolve such questions through military ways, democratic Ukraine is different from the authoritarian Putin's Russia. And the actions of the activity of Ukrainian militaries in Donbass do not give any reason to say that Ukrainian armed forces prepare to attack the occupied territory. This situation is absolutely different, however, from the situation near the borders of Ukraine, where a fully armed Russian army, strong of 150,000 personnel, is clearly prepared to launch an attack on our country. The only thing is left is a political decision of Vladimir Putin to launch this attack, and this was the topic of discussions of the civilized world leaders, and they publish their intelligence data to prevent Russian attack on Ukraine, the attack that can lead to a real humanitarian disaster. By the way, this humanitarian disaster will be a disaster not only for Ukraine and not only for European countries. It will be a disaster for Russia itself and, of course, for the occupied territories. So Pushilin and Pasechnik would have to think to what animal they serve and what interests they protect. But, of course, they betrayed their motherland long time ago. And so why those statements were made? And one of the possible courses of actions is that Kremlin decided to pick up an informational fight with the West. The West always emphasizes that a Russian army builds up near the borders with Ukraine, that the Russian army prepares to attack, that they build not only special fortifications that would help the aggressor to attack, and not only the supply of rockets being made, and not only messages spread that Putin will be himself checking the rocket potential of the Russian Federation, but they also build medical facilities that are needed to reduce casualties during the attack on the neighboring state. And in Moscow, they decided that if Russia is blamed for possible aggression against Ukraine, then let representatives of so-called People Republics be blaming Ukraine for preparing an attack against Russia. It's a similar so-called symmetric response if we consider that there is an informational war that's going on now. But I will tell you immediately that there is no informational war, just because the Western countries publish a real information, a real data, and this is not informational war. It is a real intelligence data about real possible attack, real possible shelling, bombarding, death of people, and real blood on the hands of Putin and his cronies. And but what is Russia going to do? This is international war, and that's why they probably needed statements from Pushilin and Pasechnik. But it is the best course of action, and there is a worst course of action, which would be preparing and pretext excuse for a possible attack on Ukraine. For instance, that Ukraine threatens so-called Russian-speaking population of Donbass, among which there are 700,000 of Russian citizens, or how many passports Russia issued. Or Ukraine prepares for aggression, or Ukraine shelling civilian districts of Donetsk and Luhansk, and obviously the fewer people will remain in those residential districts, where the easier will be for Russian military to shell on their own districts to create casualties, to create a pretext, excuse to attack Ukraine. And that's why Russian Federation, which of course didn't want to attack anybody and is absolutely peace-loving country, is forced to start the operation on compelling Ukraine to peace, similar like in 2008, Russia, led by Dmitry Medvedev and Putin, carried out similar operation on compelling Georgia to peace. And in this situation, the excuse, real or fabricated, is needed to Russians. And the troops which are now at the training, they just by accident appeared to be near Ukrainian border at the moment when Ukrainian armed forces, filled supplied with Western weapons, after all decided to attack Donbass and to resolve the problem of Donbass by military means. And considering that about what's going on with the statement, considering not only the statements, but also the shelling of Ukrainian free territory from the occupied territory, we can conclude that Kremlin frantically is looking for that excuse to attack. And what's interesting is that all this propaganda campaign with shelling and statement coincides in time with the end of Olympic Games in China. Similar like the attack of Russia on Ukraine in 2014 and the application of force at Maidan in time coincided with the end of Olympic Games in Sochi. Back that time, there were also talks that as soon as Olympic ends, Putin will strike on Ukraine, and before that he's looking for a pretext, and we know that he found that pretext, so-called coup, an application of force which Putin blamed on protesters. And now the situation develops according to the same scenario of looking for a pretext, an excuse for an aggression. And we only hope that the civilized world, with its strict warnings to Vladimir Putin and his cronies, will deter this group of people from the start of war, which can any time to overgrow into the world conflict. Of course, if Putin can be deterred at all.